நிஜமான கதைகளு சுவையோடு சுகமாக உருவான கதைகளு.
I have a dream speech. Martin Luther King Jr. quote inscription on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on the National Mall. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered this momentous speech in front of a crowd of over 250,000 people on August 28, 1963, as part of the March on Washington event organized by African Americans to demand equality in basic civil rights. This speech remains one of the most memorable and inspiring speeches of all time. Martin Luther King Jr. used references from the US Constitution, quotes from the Founding Fathers, quotations and sayings from the Bible, and universal ideas before finishing off his speech with what he dreamed for the African American community in terms of equal civil rights and citizenship. The March on Washington was supposed to be a mile-long walk from the Washington Memorial to the Lincoln Memorial to honor President Abraham Lincoln, who signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The event included stating the goals of the racial integration and desegregation of public places. Lincoln Memorial. Dr. King prepared this powerful speech with a lot of thought. Dr. King sought input and ideas from other great orators. Unlike many of his fellow speakers, Martin Luther King Jr. did not have a prepared written speech, which is why it never appears as a part of any of his written texts. He only went with a draft that he made up the night before in his hotel. The March on the Washington event had many other powerful speakers and musical performances by Bob Dylan, Mahalia Jackson, and John Bass. Finally, Martin Luther King Jr. walked onto the stage and took his place in front of the mic. Television cameras zoomed in on his image, which found its way into the living rooms of homes in America. He started his speech slowly and then, with his fabulous oratory and referencing skills, wove a speech so powerful that its effects are felt even today. It looked like lawmakers of that time could do nothing but work at making Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream a reality, which happened in 1964. Here are some more interesting and fascinating facts about this wonderfully inspirational speech. Interestingly, the expensive speaker system installed for the event was sabotaged before the start of the King's speech. Attorney General Robert Kennedy made sure the speaker was fixed so people could hear King speak loudly and clearly. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the founders of NAACP, died in Ghana at the age of 95 just the day before the event. The protesters honored him with a moment of silence. Nearly 60,000 people from the 250,000 gathered for the event were whites. People had come from all over the country to show their solidarity for the civil rights movement. Mahalia Jackson, one of the performers, prodded King to talk about his dream. This conversation possibly triggered the impromptu and the most exciting part of the I Have a Dream speech. Civil Rights Act 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is one of the most significant law in the history of the US. This act made racial discrimination illegal and ensured that the minorities and women received voting rights. President John F. Kennedy gave a speech on June 11, 1963 on the importance of passing the Civil Rights Act. He said the idea of civil rights was the responsibility of every citizen of the country, and the impending Civil Rights Act would ensure there was no discrimination in the use of public facilities and public places. This law, said President Kennedy, would provide protection of voting rights to all US citizens without discrimination. He then set to work with the relevant people, including Congress, to create a new civil rights bill that would include his promises of equality and dignity to every citizen. Unfortunately, President Kennedy died on November 22, 1963. His successor, President Lyndon Johnson, picked up the thread and completed the work. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed and passed on July 2, 1964. There are 11 sections or titles in the bill. Here is a summary of each of these titles. Title 1. All people in the US must have the same voting requirements. Title 2. Discrimination of all kinds at public places is illegal. Title 3. Public facilities shall be accessible by all regardless of religion, race or nationality. Title 4. Public schools shall not be segregated. Title 5. The Civil Rights Commission shall get increased powers. Title 6. Discrimination in and by government agencies is outlawed. Title 7. Employers cannot discriminate against employees based on religion, race, nationality, or gender. Title 8. Voter registration and other information shall be provided to the government. Title 9. Civil rights lawsuits shall be moved from the local courts to the federal courts. Title 10. Community relations shall be established. Title 11. Miscellaneous. If you see, almost all aspects of civil rights are covered in the Civil Rights Act 1964, which was a result of years of struggle by famous as well as the common people who fought for this kind of dignified equality in the country. Birmingham Campaign. Even during the early part of 1960s, when civil rights campaigns were at a feverish pitch in the rest of the US, Birmingham, Alabama strictly followed segregation laws. People enforced Jim Crow laws with little or no mercy. Many civil rights leaders, led by Martin Luther King Jr., Fred Shuttlesworth, and T. Walker, decided to hold the protest to bring the attention of the rest of the United States to what was happening in Birmingham. This massive protest was codenamed Project C, where C stood for confrontation. The protest was to be completely non-violent, one in the form of peaceful boycotts, sit-ins, and silent protest marches. The organizers believed that if many people participated in these non-violent protests, then the local government would confront them, which will bring national attention to the area. The protest started on April 3, 1963, with numerous volunteers boycotting local stores, marching down the streets, holding sit-ins at all white public facilities like hotels and restaurants, and kneel-ins at all white churches. The biggest opponent to this citywide protest was Bull Connor, a Birmingham politician. He got laws passed that said the protests were illegal and also threatened to send the protesters to jail. Knowing fully well they would be arrested, a group of protesters led by Martin Luther King Jr. went on a peaceful march through the streets of downtown Birmingham on April 12, 1963. As expected, all the protesters were arrested and put in jail. King was in jail until April 20, 1963, from where he wrote the famous Letter from Birmingham Jail. This letter highlighted the importance of adopting peaceful and non-violent methods of protest to achieve success. This letter, which became an important document in the history of the United States, said people have moral responsibility to ensure the laws are changed to something better. Despite the arrest of the top leaders of the civil rights movement, the campaign was not getting the attention it needed for positive change to happen. So, the organizers decided to include school children in the campaign. On May 2, 1963, more than 1,000 children took a day off from school and joined in the protest march. A lot of arrests took place and the jails in Birmingham were overflowing with protesters. As Bull Connor could not perform any more arrests, he decided to disperse the crowd of protesters by using fire hoses and setting police dogs on the children. Images of little kids knocked down by huge jets of water from fire hoses and bitten by the police dogs made headlines in national papers. Then the country sat up and took notice. However, a resolution did not happen until May 10, 1963, when the protesters and the Birmingham Council reached an agreement. Segregation laws would end and black people would also be employed as store clerks and salesmen. But the situation took a turn for the worse when a bomb went off at a hotel where Dr. King was staying. Luckily, he had already left and wasn't injured. His brother A.D. King's house was bombed too, which resulted in the protesters becoming violent. They attacked and burnt police cars and even policemen. The riots became so violent that the US Army was sent to defuse and control the situation. The largest impact of the Birmingham campaign was that some barriers to racial integration were brought down, even though a lot more work had to be done. When the new school year began in September 1963, black children enrolled in the schools that were, until then, all white schools. Racial integration had taken the first step. Most importantly, national leaders got the attention that Birmingham and its African American community deserved. Selma to Montgomery marches. There were three marches categorized under the Selma to Montgomery marches. These protests and their aftermath reached a sort of emotional and political climax in the civil rights movement of 1950s, 1960s. Here is a brief description of each of the three marches. The first march, also referred as Bloody Sunday, the first march took place on March 7, 1965. Nearly 600 civil rights protesters started from Selma and walked towards the highway. The reason for this march happened about 3 weeks before. A trooper shot Jimmy Lee Jackson, an African American, when he tried to protect his mother at a demonstration on February 18, 1965. He died of an infection 8 days later. The black population in Selma was nearly 50%, and threats and fear of harm prevented them from coming out to register to vote. The organizers of the first march wanted to bring the attention of the country to the injustice they faced in Selma. However, when the protesters had hardly covered 6 blocks, state troopers, along with Dallas County Sheriff's Department, were waiting to receive them. They attacked the peaceful protesters using bullwhips, tear gas shells, and billy clubs, all in the presence of the press. These brutal images were televised, which left the nation outraged and shocked. Many protesters covered in blood were hospitalized, which led to the nickname Bloody Sunday. The second march. Martin Luther King Jr. organized the second march on March 9, 1965, just 2 days after Bloody Sunday. Hundreds of people from all over the country joined him. The protesters even applied for a court order to prevent the police from attacking them. Shockingly, they received a restraining order instead to prevent the protests from happening. However, King was not deterred. He led a few people in a short march to Edmund Pettus Bridge, where they held a small prayer meeting before the protesters went back home. But after this, a white man's murder garnered a lot of attention in the media, even as Jimmy Lee's death that triggered these marches went almost unnoticed. The concept that only the death of white people is a cause for the concern in the country became popular again, focusing on the sad plight of African Americans. The third march. No marches could take place because of the death of the white man during the previous one. However, a court ruling allowing for peaceful demonstrations went in favor of the organizers. A third and final march was organized on March 21, 1965. This march from Selma to Montgomery was a 50-mile-long march. About 3,200 volunteers joined the march and walked 12 miles a day during daytime and sleeping in the fields at night. The protesters reached Montgomery on March 24, 1965 and camped just outside the city where an event called Stars of Freedom was held, where many famous singers like Tony Bennett, Harry Belafonte, Sammy Davis Jr., and the group Peter, Paul, and Mary performed. By the time the protesters reached the capital the next day, March 25, 1965, the number of protesters had increased to 25,000. King delivered another famous speech, how long? Not long, from the steps of the Capitol building. Within 5 months of this march, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 outlawed discrimination when it came to selling, buying, financing, or renting property. So, when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were passed, racial discrimination did reduce a bit, although it continued in the real estate industry. When African American men and soldiers lost their lives fighting in the Vietnam and other wars outside the country, their loved ones had difficulty renting and buying homes because of racial discrimination. Again, organizations like NAACP took up this cause and fought legal battles on behalf of the affected people. Martin Luther King Jr. always included the importance of fair housing in his civil rights movement speeches. After his brutal assassination, President Lyndon Johnson believed that clearing and passing the Fair Housing Act would be an appropriate legacy for King. The Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, but its power and implementation strategies got lost in the more popular Civil Rights Act. But the importance of this act cannot be understated. It helped protect the African American community's ability to have shelter. Founding of the Black Panther Party. Founded by Hugh Newton and Bobby Seale in 1966, the Black Panther Party was challenged and against the people of the African American community. The primary objective of the Black Panther Party was to keep an eye on how the police treated people from African American communities. The member of this party had a dress code of black jackets and black berets. They organized armed citizen patrols in many US cities. At the peak of the civil rights movement, the member count of the Black Panther Party was at 2,000. The two founders met as students in 1961 at Merritt College in Oakland, California. Their foray into the civil rights activism began in their student days. Their college organized Pioneer Day celebrations to remember and honor early settlers of California. These two young men protested the fact that only white people were mentioned and honored, whereas no African American person was remembered. Newton and Seale set up a group called Negro History Fact Group, which demanded that the school offer classes on the history of blacks in the US. When Malcolm X was killed, they set up the Black Panther Party to challenge police brutality and negligence when it came to offering protection for blacks. However, the members of this party also began popular social welfare programs like offering free breakfast to school-going black children and free health clinics. However, after some controversies within the party and with the police and intelligence department of the country, the Black Panther Party dissolved in 1982. The civil rights movement was a continual process that connected numerous related and unrelated events. However, the primary purpose of all the people connected with the civil rights movement was to provide an environment completely free of all kind of discrimination within the US.